All right, now we understand the value returning function, non-value returning function, and how to create a function in general, user-defined function. Let's talk about local and global variables. And that is very important when we are working with functions. So in this example, I have only one function so far. So I have function main, and I'm calling that function. So remember, if you have a function, you must call that function, otherwise you don't get any output. So if I run this, I'm going to get the main function because that is the only a statement that I have inside main. So now I want to call a function or define a function that takes a value and print it. Okay, so let's define that function. So I'm going to call it f and I'm going to keep the parentheses. So in this example, it's going to take a value and then you simply just printing that value. Okay, nothing complicated. So you're passing a value to a function and then you are printing it. Okay, so what I need to do now is call that function in my main if I want to see that output. So if I, for instance, pass 2 to that function, I should see 2 that is printed because I'm calling the function. The value 2 comes here, replaces x, or x is going to be assigned a value of 2, and then you're printing that 2. All right, so now I'm going to make some small changes, see if I can make it to work. So I'm going to assign x to 2 and change the definition of my function a bit. So I'm not going to pass anything to that function. So I have x here and I'm going to call this function and I want to see if x is going to print it here. All right, so let's try it. Okay, so I defined x in my main. All right, and I'm calling the function and I'm trying to print x. All right, so let's see if that works. I'm going to get this error because it says x is not defined. What happened? I have x here. Why it says it's not defined? Here is the problem. I defined x in this function. So x is going to be local to main function. This variable x does not exist outside of main function. All right, if you go outside of the main function, this variable doesn't exist. All right, so you cannot access it in another function. Right, so if you want to access x in another function, you need to pass that value to that function, and that is why we are passing value between functions. Otherwise, they don't exist in different functions. So if you define a variable in one function, that doesn't mean you defined it in all of the functions. That means that variable is only local to the function that you created that. All right, so if you want x to be visible inside f, you need to pass it to function f. All right, so now I'm passing this variable x to this function. So x is going to be 2, so 2 is going to be passed to this function f, and it's going to be assigned to variable x here, and this x is completely different from this x. There are 2 different variables, and then you're printing x. All right, and I can let me run it so you see that works. So I can call it whatever that I want. Okay, and then I can print out whatever. Okay, so you're passing this value 2, okay, to this function. 2 is going to be assigned to this variable whatever, and then you're printing whatever, right? So it's going to work. So whatever is local to this function, it only exists here, the lifespan of whatever is in this function f. And for x, the lifespan for x, variable x, is inside main. It only exists inside your main, does not exist outside of it. So that is for local variables. Sometimes you can create global variables. If you define a variable, if I say x equal to 2 outside of all of my functions, then that becomes a global variable, right? All of the functions are able to see that value because Python already went through that line, so it knows what x is outside of any functions. Right, so now if I want, I can like say print x, and it knows, let's change it to 100. It knows it wants to print this value 100, right? And as you see, I'm going to run it, and you see it's going to print 100 and not 2, because 2 only exists inside main, but this x exists in like in all of the functions, because that is a global variable, right? You can call it something else, but you need to make sure that you print it. I can also print y here. Okay, so here you go. So what happens if so let's say I have a local variable and I'm printing it here, and let's say I say print x. What would I get? For this one, for sure I'm going to get 100, okay, because this function does not have access to x equal to 2. But what about this function? This function have a variable 2. We also have a global variable that is assigned a different value. In this, oh, let me take the call for this function. So if you're only focused on the main. So in main, I have x assigned 2, and then I'm trying to print x. We also have a global variable which has its exact same name. If I run it, I'm going to get the value 2, because the global variable in this case, since they have exact same name, is going to be overwritten by this x inside this function. But anywhere else, x is going to be 100, right? Because this variable, this new x equal to 2, only exists inside this main. So x is local to this function, but this x is global variable. And try to not use same names if we don't need to cause less confusion. And in general, do not use any global variables, right? I do not want you to use any global variable unless I tell you to do so, right? So if you use global variables, I'm going to just let you know that you're not allowed to do that, all right? Do not use any global variables unless you're instructed to do so. So we only will work with local variables for all of our labs. In few cases, I might ask you to create a global variables. But if I do not instruct you to do that, never ever use global variables. And the simple reason behind it is global variables live throughout the entire life of your program. Okay, so you create them, you take a chunk of your memory to create those variables, but local variables only exist in through the lifespan of your function. So you create them and then you destroy them, you create them and destroy them. So you're allocating some memory for those local variables, and then you're destroying them after you're done. All right, so you just switching back and forth, and so you're freeing your memory as you go. But with global variable, they exist the entire time, so you're basically taking chunk of your memory and you're not freeing it at all. So for that reason, try to avoid having global variables and only use with like work with local variables, and that way your programs becomes more efficient. So one thing that we saw in this example was you can override global variable inside a function temporarily. Okay, so you can change it. I cannot talk today. So you can here, for instance, in this example, you have global variable. Let me just put this here. So you have global variable x100, and then you have this local variable x equal to 2. All right, so you simply inside this function main, you're overriding that global variable and you're replacing it with something else. So when you print it, you're going to see the current value of x, but in function f, you're not overriding it, so you're going to see the exact value that you have for your global variable. So if I call, so x and then f function f. So in this example, you're going to see the local variable, which is x equals to 2, and then in this one, you're going to see the global variable. Okay. Oh, actually, I shouldn't did the print because it's a non-value returning function, and I shouldn't have printed it. All right, so here you go. So 2 is the value of x that is in the main function. So you override that value temporarily in your main, and then with the f, you are using the actual value for that global variable.